Today I will introduce you to the new IONIC paint range. We will explore how these paints blend, how they compare to ARMY Painter, and whether they are truly a new product or just rebranded atoms, since the packaging looks quite familiar. And yes, there will be a giveaway in this video. To start, as a matter of fact, IONIC paints were initially intended to be a part of Atom series. That's why you may see these bottles appear in a few videos on YouTube. However, since they have different formula suited better for miniature painting, Ammo and Big Child Creatives decided to release them as a completely new line of products. I had the opportunity to spend some time with them thanks to our very first sponsor to this channel, the Hegemon shop. More about that later. Let's dive into painting. I prepared plastic spoons painted in black and white, along with few miniatures including 2 Space Marines I brought back to service after 15 years in my stash. First thing I wanted to check is how well these paints will cover over the black and white, so I painted the spoons with IONIC paints and ARMY Painter in different dilutions, using water in both cases. But the coverage was not what caught my eye. Both covered the white and black similarly, but what really stood out was how the pigment held to the surface. The spoons were prepared the same way for both brands, but the ARMY Painter began to clamp into patterns over the plain spoon surface, while IONIC remained smooth. I didn't expect this to happen right off the bat. I wasn't entirely sure why this happened over the white paint but not the black. Maybe the white provided less grip for the paint. If that's the case, it speaks even more for IONIC. Mixing test was also quite interesting. As before, I used water to thin both brands and mixed them with a brush a little. What I noticed was that the water affected them in different ways. ARMY Painter straight from the bottle appears thicker, yet when water touches it, it starts to melt completely, while IONIC, instead of melting in the water, absorbs it and kinda expands. In both cases, the outcome is the same. You end up with diluted paint. Just the feel is different. So I will give to ARMY Painter that this tactile feel can appeal more to people because you can immediately tell the difference in dilutions. In IONIC case, it's not that obvious, which you could expect to cause troubles. Yet I painted 2 models with them and it didn't come out in practice. Additionally, I tested how mixing changed when using IONIC thinner, and it appeared to break the surface tension between 2 colors, allowing them to flow into each other even more freely. So if you are worried about how responsive the paint will be, just use dedicated thinner. I also noticed on my palette that ARMY Painter dries as expected from the outside in, while IONIC paints defy this physics by drying evenly across their entire surface. Then I tested how well they wet blend. While blending itself didn't look much different between the two, the surface of the paints was quite different. ARMY Painter didn't clamp this time, perhaps because I shook it more, although the paint looked consistent each time with no signs of separation or anything. However, it cured in a grainy way, while IONIC remained smooth. Next I tested how resistant these paints would be when touched repeatedly. I scratched and sanded them, and once again there wasn't much difference in resistance itself. Yet the ARMY Painter was catching the blade like a rubber, and they smudged off rather than sanded out. While IONIC had more unified and harder structure, which may indicate that IONIC simply cures faster. Now, on to my favorite, the worn effects and chipping test. I sprayed both ARMY Painter and IONIC over the spoons at different densities. And as expected, the properties of IONIC resulted in a crisper and more realistic effect, while ARMY Painter dissolved a bit, leading to blurry details. It's fair to say that working with chipping mediums involves many variables. That doesn't mean you can't achieve similar results with ARMY Painter by tweaking the time and amount of chipping medium. However, I prefer IONIC for that task. Last test was to see how both products will obscure details. I painted Space Marines with 1 coat of undiluted paints and Adeptus Mechanicus Skitari torsos with 5 coats of diluted, speeding up the process with hairdryer. Army Painter Undiluted carried surprisingly well, yet the brush strokes were slightly visible, while IONIC remained flat. Things were looking much different with diluted coats. IONIC reached flat, smooth, evenly coated surface. Army Painter, on the other hand, built up more in the recesses, letting the primer to show through on the raised edges. This comparison yielded results I completely did not expect. I was testing basic properties, yet I found details that are not immediately obvious, but very important. While I think Army Painter is not a bad paint at all, I believe IONIC is simply more reliable. I feel I have more control over it, and I can trust it to behave as I intend. Even if I make an error, these paints seem to correct themselves almost as if they are smart. I think the self-leveling properties that allows it to cover and dry smoothly without brush marks and excessive build-up are a must-have for anyone who wants to paint tanks or bigger miniatures with no airbrush, and as well for people who wants to build smooth gradients without previous layers shining through. And before I show you how I painted this 3D printed model from Scout Cypher Studio, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to our sponsor. Hegemon is an online shop where you can find Warhammer minis, paints, tools and more. They deliver orders anywhere in Europe. Don't miss out the code for discount and link in the comments. But what I really like about them is their support for community. They sponsor Polish Warhammer champions, wargaming clubs in Germany, and they help bring numerous events to life. Plus, they are even sponsoring this set of paints to the one lucky winner. To enter for your chance to win, leave a comment under this video by the 26th of January. The winner will be randomly selected from the comments, but more about that in the description. And just to note, YouTube is not related to this contest in any way. I prepared this model before and kept his weapons separated for painting. One last thing I needed to do is to fix printer errors, because it turned out that these were the last hours of my friend's Lego printer life. First, I coated the model with black primer to better see all the defects and layer lines. And I already knew they will make my life harder with oils and enamels. But I'm going to try anyway, because I have new rain marks effect that I intend to use. I attempted to cover the obvious areas with cast armor/corroded metal textures, created using Tamiya putty diluted with plastic cement. It looked way better and gained a heavy rough look. I began to airbrush base color, and doing that, I wanted to render lights and shadows following with the shapes. With added yellow to the mix, I highlighted the model a little more and then mixed blue and red to fill the shadows with dark purple. Yet after that, I added more blue to up the contrast. Then I mixed green and violet and coated the rest of the model. After that, I applied worn effects, the product I like a lot, and try to use often because it takes some time to master. And I love the realistic results it can give you, as already seen before in this video. This time I used one yet heavier coat of worn effects. It still provided cool look, yet the paint is harder to remove, and I ended up covering way bigger area than I anticipated. Because the whole model will be dark, I wanted to give it a bright detail that will catch the eye. So I used Tamiya masking tape, worn effects and white paint to spray some stripes on his legs. After that, with a brush, I coated the base in grey color. What I like about these IONIC paints is that I was able to be sloppy. I didn't need to care about brush marks and about detail obstruction too much. I just slapped the paint on the surface and had good coverage in one go. Then I gave it a wash with diluted black. After that, I used heavily diluted greens, oranges and blues to create color variations to the stone, letting the paint to mix by itself, achieving mossy appearance. The same way I treated that random cockpit window from Star Wars model kit from Revel, I think. It will serve as a metal scrap vessel left forgotten, rusting and guttering water. I painted the stones, twig and sand that I glued with gravel and sand fixer at the bottom. After wet blending on the ground, I used my airbrush to intentionally shoot speckles from yellow paint to imitate rusty water flying around when the stones dropped in. For finishing touches, I used mentioned rainmarks effect for dusty appearance. I applied it in the spots where I would like to have most of it accumulated and started to blend and wipe it off with white spirit, brush and Q-tips. With white Uptilong 502 oil paint, I applied more environmental pollutions. I painted yellow lines on one of the cables and coated bottom of metal vessel part with gloss varnish to imitate layer of water. After varnishing, the last thing to do was metallic edge highlights with AK pencils, and the model was done.